In the autumn of his sophomore year, he boards a particularly crowded train at Union Station. It is the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. He edges through the compartments, his duffel bag heavy with books for his Renaissance architecture class, for which he has to write a paper over the next 5 days. Passengers have already staked out parts of the vestibule, sitting glumly on the luggage. "Standing room only," the conductor hollers. "I want my money back," a passenger complains. Gogol keeps walking from one compartment to the next, looking for an uncrowded vestibule in which he might sit. In the very last car of the train he sees an empty seat. A girl is seated next to the window reading a folded back issue of the New Yorker. Arranged on the seat beside her is a chocolate brown, shearling-lined suede coat, which is what had caused the person in front of Gogol to move on. But something tells Gogol the coat belongs to the girl, and so he stops and says, "Is that yours?" She lifts up her narrow body and, in a single swift motion, arranges the coat beneath her buttocks and legs. It's a face he recognizes from campus, someone he has crossed paths with in the corridors of buildings as he walks to and from class. He remembers that, freshman year, she had had her hair dyed an emphatic shade of cranberry red, cut to her jaw. She has grown it to her shoulders now, and allowed it to resume what appears to be its natural shade, light brown with bits of blonde here and there. It is parted just off-center, a bit crooked at the base. The hair of her eyebrows is darker, lending her otherwise friendly features a serious expression. She wears a pair of nicely faded jeans, brown leather boots with yellow laces and thick rubber soles. A cabled sweater, the same flecked grey of her eyes, is too large for her, the sleeves coming partway up her hands. A man's billfold bulges prominently from the front pocket of her jeans. "Hi, I'm Ruth," she says, recognizing him in that same vague way. "I'm Nickel." He sits, too exhausted to put his duffel bag away in the luggage rack overhead. He shoves it as best he can under his seat, his long legs bent awkwardly, aware that he is perspiring. He unzips his blue down parka. He massages his fingers, crisscrossed with welts from the leather straps of the bag. "Sorry," Ruth says, watching him. "I guess I was just trying to put off the inevitable." Still seated, he pries his arms free of the parka. "What do you mean?" "Making it look like someone was sitting here, with a coat." "It's pretty brilliant, actually. Sometimes I pretend to fall asleep for the same reason," he admits. "No one wants to sit next to me if I'm sleeping." She laughs softly, putting a strand of her hair behind her ear. Her beauty is direct, unassuming. She wears no makeup apart from something glossy on her lips. two small brown moles by her right cheekbone are the only things that distract from the pale peach of her complexion. She has slim, small hands with unpolished nails and ragged cuticles. She leans over to put the magazine away and get a book from the bag at her feet, and he briefly glimpses the skin above her waistband. "Are you going to Boston?" he asks. "Maine. That's where my dad lives. I have to switch to a bus at South Station. It's another 4 hours from here. What college are you in?" "JE." He learns that she is in Silliman, that she is planning to be an English major, comparing notes of their experiences at college. So far, they discover that they had both taken Psychology 110 the previous spring. The book in her hands is a paperback copy of Timon of Athens, and though she keeps a finger marking her page, she never reads a word of it. Nor does he bother to open up the volume on perspective he has pulled out of his duffel. She tells him she was raised on a commune in Vermont, the child of hippies, educated at home until the 7th grade. Her parents are divorced now. Her father lives with her stepmother, raising llamas on a farm. Her mother, an anthropologist, is doing field work on midwives in Thailand. He cannot imagine coming from such parents, such a background, and when he describes his own upbringing, it feels bland by comparison. But Ruth expresses interest, asking about his visits to Kolkata. She tells him her parents went to India once, to an ashram somewhere, before she was born. She asks what the streets are like, and the houses, and so on. The back page of his book on perspective, Gogol draws a floor plan of his maternal grandparents' flat, navigating Ruth along the verandas and the terrazzo flowers, telling her about the chalky blue walls, the narrow stone kitchen, the sitting room with cane furniture that looked as if it belonged on a porch. He draws with confidence, thanks to the drafting course he is taking this term. He shows her the room where he and Sonia sleep when they visit, and describes the view of the tiny lane lined with corrugated tin-roofed businesses. When he is finished, Ruth takes the book from him and looks at the drawing he has made, trailing her finger through the rooms. "I'd love to go," she says, and suddenly he imagines her face and arms, tan, a backpack strapped to her shoulders, walking along Chowringhee as other Western tourists do, shopping in Newmarket, staying at the Grand. As they are talking, a woman across the aisle reprimands them. "She's been trying to take a nap," she says. This only goads them into talking further, in lowered voices, their heads leaning in toward each other. Gogol is unaware of which state they are in, which stations they have passed. The train rumbles over a bridge. The setting sun is feverishly beautiful, casting a striking pink glow on the facades of the clapboard houses that dot the water's edge. In minutes these shades fade, replaced by the pallor that precedes dusk. When it is dark, he sees that their images are reflected at an angle in the glass, hovering as if outside the train. Their throats are parched from talking, and at one point he offers to go to the cafe car. She asks him to get her a bag of potato chips and a cup of tea with milk. He likes that she doesn't bother to pull the billfold out of her jeans, that she allows him to buy them for her. He returns with a coffee for himself and the chips and the tea, along with a paper cup of milk the bartender has given him instead of the regulation container of cream. They continue talking, Ruth eating the chips, brushing the salt from around her lips with the back of her hand. She offers some to Gogol, pulling them out for him one by one. He tells her about the meals he had eaten on Indian trains, the time he travelled with his family to Delhi and Agra, the rotis and slightly sour dal offered at one station and delivered hot at the next, the thick vegetable cutlets served with bread and butter for breakfast. He tells her about the tea, how it was bought through the window from men on the platform who poured it from giant aluminium kettles, the milk and sugar already mixed in, and how it was drunk in crude clay cups that were smashed afterward on the tracks. Her appreciation for these details flatters him. It occurs to him that he has never spoken of his experiences in India to any American friend. They part suddenly, Gogol working up the nerve to ask for her number at the last minute, writing it into the same book where he had drawn her the floor plan. He wishes he could wait with her at South Station for her bus to Maine, but he has a commuter train to catch in 10 minutes to take him to the suburbs. The days of the holiday feel endless. All he can think of is getting back to New Haven and calling Ruth. He wonders how many times they have crossed paths, how many meals they have unwittingly shared in commons. He thinks back to Psychology 110, wishing his memory would yield some image of her, taking notes on the other side of the law school auditorium, her head bent over her desk. Most often he thinks of the train, longs to sit beside her again, imagines their faces flushed from the heat of the compartment, their bodies cramped in the same way, her hair shining from the yellow lights overhead. On the ride back he looks for her, combing each and every compartment, but she is nowhere and he ends up sitting next to an elderly nun with a brown habit and prominent white down on her upper lip, who snores all the way. The following week, back at Yale, Ruth agrees to meet him for coffee at the Atticus bookshop. She is a few minutes late and dressed in the same jeans and boots and chocolate suede coat she had worn when they met. Again she asks for tea. At first he senses an awkwardness he hadn't felt on the train. The cafe feels loud and hectic, the table between them too wide. Ruth is quieter than before, looking down at her cup and playing with the sugar packets. her eyes occasionally wandering to the books that line the walls. But soon enough they are conversing easily, as they had before, exchanging tales of their respective holidays. He tells her about how he and Sonia occupied the kitchen on Pemberton Road for a day, stuffing a turkey and rolling out doughs for pies, things his mother did not particularly like to do. "I looked for you on my way back," he admits to her, telling her about the snoring nun. Afterward, they walk together through the Centre for British Art. There is an exhibit of Renaissance works on paper, which they have both been meaning to see. He walks her back to Silliman, and they arrange to have coffee a few days later. After saying good night, Ruth lingers by the gate, looking down at the books pressed up to her chest, and he wonders if he should kiss her, which is what he has been wanting to do for hours, or whether, in her mind, they are only friends. She starts walking backward toward her entryway, smiling at him, taking an impressive number of steps before giving a final wave and turning away. He begins to meet her after her classes, remembering her schedule, looking up at the buildings and hovering casually under the archways. She always seems pleased to see him, stepping away from her girlfriends to say hello. "Of course she likes you," Jonathan tells Gogol, patiently listening to a minute account of their acquaintance one night in the dining hall. A few days later, following Ruth back to her room because she has forgotten a book she needed for a class, he places his hand over hers as she reaches for the doorknob. Her roommates are out. He waits for her on the sofa in the common room as she searches for the book. It is in the middle of the day, overcast, lightly raining. "Found it," she says, and though they both have classes, they remain in the room, sitting on the sofa and kissing until it is too late to bother going. Every evening they study together at the library, sitting at either end of the table to keep from whispering. She takes him to her dining hall and he to hers. He takes her to the sculpture garden. He thinks of her constantly while leaning over the slanted board in his drafting class, under the strong white lights of the studio, and in the darkened lecture hall of his Renaissance architecture class, as images of Paladin villas flash onto the screen from a slide projector. Within weeks the end of the semester is upon them, and they are besieged by exams and papers and hundreds of pages of reading. Far more than the amount of work he faces, he dreads the month of separation they will have to endure at winter break. One Saturday afternoon, just before exams, she mentions to him in the library that both her roommates will be out all day. They walk together through Cross Campus, back to Silliman, and he sits with her on her unmade bed. The room smells as she does, a powdery floral smell that lacks the acridness of perfume. Postcards of authors are taped to the wall over her desk. Oscar Wilde and Virginia Woolf. Their lips and faces are still numb from the cold, and, at first, They still keep their coats on. They lie together against the shearling lining of hers, and she guides his hand beneath her bulky sweater. It had not been like this the first time, the only other time, that he had been with a girl. He recalled nothing from that episode, only being thankful afterward that he was no longer a virgin. But this time he is aware of everything, the warm hollow of Ruth's abdomen, the way her lank hair rests in the thick strands on the pillow, the way her features change slightly when she is lying down. "You're great, Nikhil," she whispers as he touches small breasts set wide apart, one pale nipple slightly larger than the other. He kisses them, kisses the moles scattered on her stomach, as she arcs gently toward him. He feels her hands on his head and then on his shoulders, guiding them between her parted legs. He feels inept, clumsy, as he tastes and smells her there. And yet he hears her whispering his name, telling him it feels wonderful. She knows what to do. Unzipping his jeans, standing up at one point, and getting a diaphragm case from her bureau drawer. A week later, he is home again, helping Sonia and his mother decorate the tree, shoveling the driveway with his father, going to the mall to buy last-minute gifts. He mopes around the house, restless, pretending to be coming down with a cold. He wishes he could simply borrow his parents' car and drive up to Maine to see Ruth after Christmas, or that she could visit him. He was perfectly welcome, she had assured him. Her father and stepmother wouldn't mind. They had put him in the guest room, she said. At night he'd creep into her bed. He imagines himself in the farmhouse she has described to him, waking up to eggs frying in a skillet, walking with her through the snowy abandoned fields. But such a trip would require telling his parents about Ruth, something he has no desire to do. He has no patience for their surprise, their nervousness, their quiet disappointment, their questions about what Ruth's parents did and whether or not the relationship was serious. As much as he longs to see her, he cannot picture her at the kitchen table on Pemberton Road in her jeans and her bulky sweater, politely eating his mother's food. He cannot imagine being with her in the house where he is still Gogol. He speaks to her when his family is asleep, quietly in the empty kitchen, charging the calls to his telephone at school. They arrange to meet one day in Boston and spend the day together in Harvard Square. There is a foot of snow on the ground, and the sky is a piercing blue. They go first to a movie at the Parental, buying tickets for whatever is about to begin, sitting at the back of the balcony and kissing, causing people to turn back and stare. They have lunch at Cafe Pamplona, eating pressed ham sandwiches and bowls of garlic soup off in a corner. They exchange presents. She gives him a small used book of drawings by Goya, and he gives her a pair of blue woolen mittens and a mixtape of his favorite Beatles songs. They discover a store just above the cafe that sells nothing but architecture books, and he browses the aisles treating himself to a paperback edition of Le Corbusier's Journey to the East, for he is thinking of declaring himself an architecture major in the spring. Afterward, they wander hand in hand, kissing now and then against a building, along the very streets he was pushed up and down in his stroller as a child. He shows her the American professor's house where he and his parents once lived, a time before Sonia was born, years that he has no memory of. He has seen the house in pictures, knows from his parents the name of the street. Whoever lives there now appears to be away. The snow hasn't been cleared from the porch steps, and a number of rolled-up newspapers have collected on the doormat. "I wish we could go inside," he says. "I wish we could be alone together." Looking at the house now, with Ruth at his side, her mittened hand in his, he feels strangely helpless. Though he was only an infant at the time, he feels nevertheless betrayed by his inability to know then that one day, years later, he would return to the house under such different circumstances, that he would be so happy. By the following year, his parents know vaguely about Ruth, though he has been to the farmhouse in Maine twice, meeting her father and her stepmother. Sonia, who secretly has a boyfriend these days, is the only person in his family to have met Ruth during a weekend when Sonia came to New Haven. His parents have expressed no curiosity about his girlfriend. His relationship with her is one accomplishment in his life about which they are not in the least bit proud or pleased. Ruth tells him she doesn't mind his parents' disapproval, that she finds it romantic. But Gogol knows it isn't right. He wishes his parents could simply accept her, as her family accepts him, without pressure of any kind. "You're too young to get involved this way," Ashok and Ashima tell him. They've even gone so far as to point out examples in Bengali men they know who have married Americans, marriages that have ended in divorce. It only makes things worse when he says that marriage is the last thing on his mind. At times, he hangs up on them. He pities his parents when they speak to him this way, for having no experience of being young and in love. He suspects that they are secretly glad when Ruth goes away to Oxford for a semester. She had mentioned her interest in going there long ago, in the first weeks of their courtship, when the spring of junior year had felt like a remote speck on the horizon. She had asked him if he minded if she applied, and though the idea of her being so far had made him queasy. He had said no, of course not. That 12 weeks would go like that. He is lost that spring without her. He spends all his time in the studio, especially the Friday nights and weekends. He would normally have been with her. The two of them eating at Naples and going to see movies in the law school auditorium. He listens to the music she loves. Simon and Garfunkel, Neil Young, Cat Stevens. Buying himself brand new copies of the albums she had inherited from her parents. It sickens him to think of the physical distance between them, to think that when he is asleep at night, she is leaning over a sink somewhere, brushing her teeth and washing her face to start the next day. He longs for her as his parents have longed all these years for the people they love in India. For the first time in his life, he knows this feeling. But his parents refuse to give him the money to fly to England on his spring break. He spends what little money he has from working in the dining hall on transatlantic phone calls to Ruth twice a week. Twice a day he checks his campus mailbox for letters and postcards stamped with the multicolored profiles of the Queen. He carries these letters and postcards wherever he goes, stuck into his books. My Shakespeare class is the best I've ever taken, she has written in violet-colored ink. The coffee is undrinkable. Everyone constantly says, "Cheers." I think of you all the time. One day he attends a panel discussion about Indian novels written in English. He feels obligated to attend. One of the presenters on the panel, Amit, is a distant cousin who lives in Bombay, whom Gogol has never met. His mother has asked him to greet Amit on her behalf. Gogol is bored by the panelists, who keep referring to something called marginality, as if it were some sort of medical condition. For most of the hour he sketches portraits of panelists who sit hunched over their papers along a rectangular table. Teleologically speaking, ABCDs are unable to answer the question, "Where are you from?" the sociologist on the panel declares. Gogol has never heard of the term ABCD. He eventually gathers that it stands for American-born, confused Desi. In other words, him. He learns that the C could also stand for conflicted. He knows that Deshi, a generic word for countryman, means Indian, knows that his parents and all their friends always refer to India simply as Desh. But Gogol never thinks of India as Desh. He thinks of it as Americans do, as India. Gogol slouches in his seat and ponders certain awkward truths. For instance, although he can understand his mother tongue and speak it fluently, he can't read or write it, even with modest proficiency. On trips to India, his American accented English is a source of endless amusement to his relatives, and when he and Sonia speak to each other, aunts and uncles and cousins always shake their heads in disbelief and say, I don't understand a word. Living with a pet name and a good name, in a place where such distinctions do not exist. Surely that was emblematic of the greatest confusion of all. He searches the audience for someone he knows, but it isn't his crowd. Lots of lit majors, with leather sashes and gold-rimmed glasses and fountain pens. Lots of people Ruth would have waved to. There are also lots of ABCDs. He has no idea that there is this many on campus. He has no ABCD friends at college. He avoids them, for they remind him too much of the way his parents choose to live, befriending people not so much because they like them, but because of a past they happen to share. Gogol, why aren't you a member of the Indian Association here? Amit asks later, when they go for a drink at the Anchor. I just don't have the time, Gogol says, not telling his well-meaning cousin that he can think of no greater hypocrisy than joining an organization that willingly celebrates occasions his parents forced him, throughout his childhood and adolescence, to attend. I'm nickel now, Gogol says, suddenly depressed by how many more times he will have to say this, asking people to remember, reminding them to forget, feeling as if an errata slip was perpetually pinned to his chest. Thanksgiving of his senior year, he takes the train alone up to Boston. He and Ruth are no longer together. Instead of coming back from Oxford after those 12 weeks, she has stayed on to do a summer course, explaining that a professor she admired would be retiring after that. Gogol had spent the summer on Pemberton Road. He had had an unpaid internship at a small architecture firm in Cambridge, where he had run errands at Charette for the designers, been sent to photograph nearby sites, lettered a few drawings. To make money he worked nights washing dishes at an Italian restaurant in his parents' town. Late in August, he'd gone to Logan to welcome Ruth home. He had waited for her at the arrival gate, taken her to a hotel for one night, paying for it with the money he had made at the restaurant. The room overlooked the public garden, its walls covered with thickly striped pink and cream paper. They had made love for the first time in a double bed. They had gone out for their meals, neither of them able to afford the items on the room service menu. They walked up Newbury Street and went to a Greek restaurant with tables on the sidewalk. The day was blazing hot. Ruth looked the same, but her speech was peppered with words and phrases she had picked up in England. Like, I imagine, and I suppose, and presumably. She spoke of her semester and how much she had liked England. The travelling she had done in Barcelona and Rome. She wanted to go back to England for graduate school, she said. I imagine they have got good architecture schools, she had added. You could come as well. The next morning he had put her on the bus to Maine, but within days of being together again in New Haven, In an apartment he had rented on Hove Street with friends, they had begun fighting, both admitting, in the end, that something had changed. They avoid each other now. When they happen to cross paths in the library or on the streets. He has scratched out her phone number and the addresses he had written down for her at Oxford and in Maine. But, boarding the train, it is impossible not to think of the afternoon. 2 years ago they had met. As usual, the train is incredibly crowded, and this time he sits for half the journey in the vestibule. After Westerly he finds a seat and settles down with the course selection guide for the next semester. But he feels distracted for some reason, gloomy, impatient to be off the train. He does not bother to remove his coat, does not bother to go to the cafe car for something to drink, even though he is thirsty. He puts away the course guide and opens up a library book that might be helpful for his senior thesis project, a comparison between Renaissance Italian and Mughal palace design. But after a few paragraphs, he closes this book as well. His stomach growls and he wonders what there will be for dinner at home, what his father has prepared. His mother and Sonia have gone to India for 3 weeks to attend a cousin's wedding, and this year Gogol and his father will spend Thanksgiving at the home of friends. He angles his head against the window and watches the autumnal landscape pass. The spewing pink and purple waters of a dye mill, electrical power stations, a big ball-shaped water tank covered with rust, abandoned factories with rows of small square windows partly bashed in, ravaged as if by moths. On the trees the topmost branches are bare, the remaining leaves yellow, paper-thin. The train moves more slowly than usual, and when he looks at his watch, he sees that they are running well behind schedule. And then, somewhere outside Providence, in an abandoned, grassy field, the train stops. For over an hour they stand there as solid, scarlet disk of sun sinks into the tree-lined horizon. The lights turn off, and the air inside the train turns uncomfortably warm. The conductors rush anxiously through the compartments. "Probably a broken wire," the gentleman sitting beside Gogol remarks. Across the aisle, a grey-haired woman reads, a coat clutched like a blanket to her chest. Behind him, 2 students discuss the poems of Ben Jonson. Without the sound of the engine, Gogol can hear an opera playing faintly on someone's Walkman. Through the window he admires the darkening, sapphire sky. He sees a spare lengths of rusted rails heaped in piles. It isn't until they start moving again that an announcement is made on the loudspeaker about a medical emergency. But the truth, overheard by one of the passengers from a conductor, quickly circulates. A suicide has been committed. A person had jumped in front of the train. He is shocked and discomfited by the news, feeling bad about his irritation and impatience. wondering if the victim had been a man or a woman, young or old. He imagines the person consulting the same schedule that's on his backpack, determining exactly when the train would be passing through, the approach of the train's headlights. As a result of the delay, he misses his commuter rail connection in Boston, waits another 40 minutes for the next one. He puts a call through to his parents' house, but no one answers. He tries his father's department at university, but there too the phone rings and rings. At the station, he sees his father waiting on a darkened platform, wearing sneakers and corduroys, anxiousness in his face. A trench coat is belted around his waist, a scarf knitted by Ashima wrapped in his throat, a tweed cap on his head. "Sorry I'm late," Gogol says. "How long have you been waiting?" "Since 5:45, his father says. Gogol looks at his watch. It is nearly 8. "There was an accident." "I know. I called. What happened? Were you hurt?" Gogol shakes his head. "Someone jumped onto the tracks, somewhere in Rhode Island. I tried to call you. They had to wait for the police, I think." "I was worried." "I hope you haven't been standing out in the cold all this time," Gogol says. And from his father's lack of response, he knows that this is exactly what he has done. Gogol wonders what it's like for his father to be without his mother and Sonia. He wonders if he is lonely. But his father is not the type to admit such things, to speak openly of his desires, his moods, his needs. They walk to the parking lot, get into the car, and begin the short drive home. The night is windy, so much so that the car jostles slightly from time to time, and brown leaves as large as human feet fly across the room in the headlights' glare. Normally on these rides back from the station, his father asks questions about his classes, about his finances, about his plans of graduation and after graduation. But tonight they are silent. Ashok concentrating on driving. Gogol fidgets with the radio, switching from the AM news station to NPR. "I want to tell you something," his father says when the piece ends, once they have already turned onto Pemberton Road. "What?" Gogol asks. "It's about your name." Gogol looks at his father, puzzled. "My name?" His father shuts off the radio. Gogol. These days he is called Gogol so seldom that the sound of it no longer upsets him as it used to. After 3 years of being Nikhil, the vast majority of the time, he no longer minds. "There is a reason for it, you know," his father continues. "Right, Baba. Gogol's your favorite author. I know." "No," his father says. He pulls into the driveway and switches off the engine, then the headlights. He undoes his seat belt, guiding it with his hand as he retracts back behind his left shoulder. "Another reason." And as they sit together in the car, his father revisits a field 209 kilometers from Howrah. With his fingers, he lightly grasping the bottom of the steering wheel, his gaze directed toward the windshield at the garage door. He tells Gogol the story of the train he had ridden 28 years ago in October 1961 on his way to visit his grandfather in Jamshedpur. He tells him about the night he had nearly taken his life, and the book that had saved him, and about the year afterward when he had been unable to move. Gogol listens, stunned, his eyes fixed on his father's profile. Though there are only inches between them, for an instant his father is a stranger, a man who has kept a secret, has survived a tragedy, a man whose past he does not fully know, a man who is vulnerable, who has suffered in an inconceivable way. He imagines his father in his 20s as Gogol is now, sitting on a train as Gogol had just been, reading a story, and then, suddenly, nearly killed. He struggles to picture the West Bengal countryside he has seen only a few occasions. His father's mangled body among hundreds of dead ones, being carried on a stretcher past a twisted length of maroon compartments. Against instinct, he tries to imagine life without his father, a world in which his father does not exist. "Why didn't I know this about you?" Gogol says. His voice sounds harsh, accusing, but his eyes well with tears. "Why haven't you told me this until now?" "It never felt like the right time," his father says. "But it's like you have lied to me all these years." When his father doesn't respond, he adds, "That's why you have that limp, isn't it?" "It happened so long ago. I didn't want to upset you." "It doesn't matter. You should have told me." "Perhaps," his father concedes, glancing briefly in Gogol's direction. He removes the keys from the ignition. "Come, you must be hungry. The car is getting cold." But Gogol doesn't move. He sits there, still struggling to absorb the information, feeling awkward, oddly ashamed, at fault. "I'm sorry, Baba." His father laughs softly. "You had nothing to do with it." "Does Sonia know?" His father shakes his head. "Not yet. I'll explain it to her one day. In this country, only your mother knows. And now you. I've always meant for you to know, Gogol." And suddenly, the sound of his pet name, uttered by his father as he has been accustomed to hearing it all his life, means something completely new, bound up with a catastrophe he has unwittingly embodied for years. "Is that what you think of when you think of me?" Gogol asks him. "Do I remind you of that night?" "Not at all." his father says eventually, one hand going to his ribs, a habitual gesture that has baffled Gogol until now. You remind me of everything that followed.